actually. And so don't get me wrong. But it's just the view of how Arab leverage has on the issue of Palestine has diminished over time is really startling when you start with that point. But let's think about 67 particularly, and let me just go through a couple of the things that I think had the consequence, besides the obvious, which is that Israel came to control all of historic Palestine, including the West Bank and Gaza, and Palestinians came under occupation, that the 67, in essence, began the decline of Arab support for the Palestinians at the very same time that it pushed the Palestinians to go it alone as much as they could with bolstering Palestinian nationalism. That's what it did. Now, let me tell you why that is the case. First, when you look at the Palestinian struggle after 48, it certainly was about the right of return. And very quickly, it was about Arab nationalism, because the Palestinians weren't really so much focused on their nationalism or their sense of nationhood as much as the question of justice tied to a broader Arab cause. Here you have the rise of Jamal Abdel Nasser in 1952, who is essentially saying that Palestine is the core of the Arabs, is the Arab nationalism. This is an Arab cause. It's not a Palestinian cause. And so the leader of the most powerful Arab state is adopting your cause. Obviously, Palestinians adopted Arab nationalism. And the extent to which Palestinians adopted Arab nationalism, people don't quite internalize that, I think, because it intellectually, emotionally, and certainly practically, because it was the most promising avenue to regain Palestinian right, was seen to be in this collective Arab action. Obviously, even in 48, it wasn't really a national cause that the Arabs felt was at stake, but sort of Arab rights being taken, and Palestine as part of the Arab world. And so much so that I want to fast forward a little bit to tell you how this preoccupation in Palestinian minds with Arab nationalism versus Palestinian nationalism, even after the Palestinian nationalism emerged, remained a real issue for Palestinians. Fast forward to 1982, when Israel invaded Lebanon, and then the PLO became besieged, and then ultimately was forced to withdraw through a deal and went into exile in Tunis. And when the Palestinians left Lebanon, the PLO, obviously headquarters were moved from Lebanon ultimately to Tunis. The first act was for Yasser Arafat, instead of stopping in an Arab country, he went through Greece, and the PLO magazine, Palestine Thawra, immediately moved its headquarters to Cyprus, not to an Arab country, to Cyprus. And so I want to read you an exchange in the following issues of Palestine Thawra, which was indication about sort of the struggle that people were feeling, because this was a moment, obviously, where the PLO was left to fight the war alone, and obviously couldn't succeed, and ultimately was forced to withdraw. And there were people like Muammar Gaddafi calling on the Palestinians, better to commit suicide on behalf of the Arab nation. If you recall that was kind of an example of Palestine seen not as a Palestine case, but as something for the Arab nation itself. And so you have a student, a Saudi student, wrote a letter to the editor of Palestine Thawra at that time, and he said, "Why did you not choose an Arab state as your center, as we all would have expected? I had not expected that the PLO would be so ungrateful to all the aid provided by the Arabs, especially since the liberation of Palestine is the primary Arab concern." So this is a Saudi student writing to Palestine Thawra editor. So here's the reply from the editor. He said, The PLO is not ungrateful. The deposits of one Arab state in the United States provide a sufficient budget for the liberation of Palestine in a year. Payment in blood cannot be compared with monetary payment. This revolution is indeed Arab, but Palestinian decisions shall remain independent regardless of the cost. Now, that was the response of the editor. So I want you to think about that for a minute, which is sort of Palestinian defiance at a time when they were left alone. But then there's an intellectual article that is actually the lead article. And the lead article is much more reflective because this is just an exchange of letters, right? So this is not a central thesis of how the thinking goes. The lead article is about who's a Palestinian and who's an Arab, and what does that mean? That was right there and then at that time. And here's the lead article. The conclusion is the Palestinian considers himself first Arab, second Arab, and third Palestinian. And that was even at that moment of vulnerability because intellectually it was hard for Palestinians to peel themselves off from the pan-Arabism that was so promising to their aspirations. And because also they still needed Arab support. They were still vulnerable and they still needed Arab support. So and in 1967, that's when it all started, this dilemma. Because Nasser, when you look at Jamal Abdel Nasser, he captured the imagination of a lot of Arabs. We didn't have polling to know how much, but we do know from events that have happened across the region and from testimony across the board that he captured the hearts of many, many Arabs across the board. And clearly, he made the question of Palestine a central mission for Arab nationalism. And in fact, one reason why he could make the proposition that Egypt should be the one who leads the Arab world, as opposed to Saudi Arabia or Jordan or other countries that were contending for leadership at that time, was one thing, the claim that Egypt is the only one that can use its military power to achieve Arab aspirations in liberating Palestine and in fighting off Western imperialism. The two were tied together. And obviously he used the 56 war in which the attack on him failed as an example. So the issue for him, was Palestine was so central to Arab nationalism, even aside from whether he succeeded in unifying countries together or getting Arab unity, but aspirationally, the promise, the psychology of Arab nationalism, the psychology of the faith in Nasser rested on his ability to deliver militarily. And obviously in 67, there was tremendous hope among followers of pan-Arabism. This would be his moment of delivery. And instead, of course, we know what happened. And I say, in fact, the Arab world into a collective depression from which some may not have recovered. Because it was really the death of aspirations, because that's how it was tied to this pan-Arabism. And with it, obviously, in a way, the recognition that Israel was not about to disappear, as some had argued, and in fact was able to not only occupy the rest of historic Palestine, but Egyptian territory and Syrian territory. And this is what I want to say about that, is that aside from the psychology of here is an Arab, the country, put aside Syria for a moment, but certainly Egypt because of Nasser's leadership role, put aside even Jordan, which joined the war in 67. But Nasser was, of course, the center of the hope. And certainly his military defeat led to the death of aspiration. But in practical terms, that wasn't the biggest problem. In practical terms, it was that Israel came to occupy the Sinai and the Golan Heights. And why is that in practical term more important? Because that's the time when, in fact, then Egypt and Syria had territories of their own to get back from Israel that they wanted more than they wanted to help the Palestinians. And ultimately that really opened the door for Egypt to go it alone in Camp David because they wanted to get their Sinai back. And that became much more important. And up until then, Nasser's focus on Israel and Palestine wasn't particularly costly. And frankly, in '56, he certainly didn't start that war. It was a tripartite aggression on him. Britain, France, and Israel launched that war in '56. He didn't initiate that war. He didn't want that war. And he didn't win it militarily, but he won it politically. But so he had not really fought a war over Palestine. He had rhetorically made the argument that he could win, and that was enough to get the aspiration of the people, given what the interpretation of the framing of 1956. So Nasser had not really paid a particularly heavy price over Palestine. Even, by the way, in '67, I want you to think about this a little bit, because there's a lot of reframing of what actually happened. Now, Nasser himself in '67, by most accounts, certainly by mine, I've studied this, I've written about that. And there's room for disagreement here because we don't know all the facts, still even now, 50 years later. But in my own opinion, Nasser wasn't going out there to fight war with Israel. Nasser had been engaged in an Arab Cold War, what Malcolm Kerr called the Arab Cold War, and yes, he is, by the way, the father of Steve Kerr, who's just won the NBA championship last night for the Warriors. Malcolm Kerr was somebody I knew who had been a professor at UCLA and then became the president of the American University in Beirut before, unfortunately, tragically, he was assassinated. He wrote a book that was pretty well known called The Arab Cold War, documenting that period from '56 through '67, sort of where the Arab Cold War, by which he meant Nasser and the Arab nationalists versus their foes in the Arab world, like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, and the monarchies, particularly across the Arab world. And when you look at that, Nasser, after ascending after '56, started declining in a little bit in his influence after he started intervening in Yemen, and the Yemeni intervention was not particularly successful. And then the United Arab Republic that he formed with Egypt, with the Syria and Iraq disintegrated. So he was on the defensive in the '60s, and in fact, the whole tension started when the Soviets gave the Egyptians information that Israel is massing to attack Syria. And all of his moves were essentially out there to say, if you go to war with Syria, you're going to war with me. He's using his leverage as the most powerful Arab state to gain more credibility in the Arab world. And so his moves were intended essentially as a deterrent. And so if the Israelis didn't attack, as he probably suspected they're not going to attack, then he still would reap the benefits, because he would have been seen to have stopped Israel from attacking Syria and used his credibility as the most powerful Arab state to defend the Arab nation. So he certainly did take moves that were aggressive toward Israel, in blocking the waterway and calling for the withdrawal of UN forces from Sinai and then moving forces into the Sinai. But by all accounts, his intent wasn't to wage war. In fact, toward the end of the crisis, just before June 5th, Egyptian diplomats and their allies, particularly the Soviet Union, were trying to do everything they can to prevent the war from happening, because the assessment was Israel had the upper hand, actually. And here in the U.S., the U.S. assumed that Israel would win, although there was some, not with the same kind of speed. And the Israelis were trying to get the U.S. to support them to launch the war on June 5. Now, whatever the Israeli moves were intended for, you can argue that they couldn't live with an ascendant Nasser, because without a war, he would have won anyway, politically. You could make that argument. But there's no question, whatever their intent at that time and their calculation versus the prospects of war, that there were two things that they stood to benefit from that had a history in their strategy from the beginning. One is that they always thought that isolating Egypt from the rest of the Arab world was the best military strategy to not, have a possibility of an effective Arab attack. So, in fact, in 1956, when they came to occupy the Sinai, they went into a campaign to try to persuade Eisenhower to at least let them keep a little piece of territory through which they can negotiate bilaterally with Egypt, to isolate it, to make a bilateral issue with Egypt, to take it out of the Palestine equation. And there's no question that that had been part of their thinking throughout. And so this was obviously, whatever the causes, the immediate causes were, there was some benefit that would accrue by holding on to Egyptian territory, and that proved to be right, because it was, in fact, the Egyptian incentive ultimately to have a peace agreement. And the second is that whatever the reason was for the immediate attack on the immediate occupation of the West Bank, and certainly the King of Jordan joined Nasser at that time in the war, but the extent to which the Israelis moved across, taking East Jerusalem as well as the entire West Bank, is of course debated now, whether that was planned or not planned. And whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, even from the Israeli point of view, the Israelis debate that to this day, as you know, if you're reading the present analysis. But here's one thing that we know about, and that is that the Israelis had never accepted the armistice line with Jordan as a final boundary. That is, they've never accepted that the armistice of 1949 between the West Bank and Israel is the final boundary, because it wasn't. And this, by the way, is not just a function of the lure of the rise of religious parties in Israel. There is that, because after the invoking biblical metaphors after the occupation of the West Bank certainly solidified the groups within Israel who were more religious Zionists than secular Zionists. But if you look back, as we have a record. I've written about this before. For example, in 1949, when the armistice lines were being discussed between Israel and the neighboring Arab states, one of the questions was whether, if in fact Israel was offered peace by Arab states, whether Israel would accept it. So Moshe Sharet, who was a secular Zionist, who was the foreign minister at the time of Israel, said in a government meeting, he said, if Egypt were to offer us a peace agreement along the lines of the armistice, post-48 armistice line, we should take it. That's fine. If Syria should offer us one, the only reservations we have is really that we don't like the government of Syria, but he had no problems with the boundaries. But if Jordan were to offer us peace now along these armistice lines, we should not take it. There was no question in that whether they're secular or religious, there was no acceptance of that line within Israel itself. And obviously, what happened afterwards, in a way, reveals that, because a lot of the proposals that came out of the secular Israeli parties were not full withdrawal, and obviously the annexation of East Jerusalem took place almost immediately after. So whatever the immediate causes were who fired the first shot, there was something bigger going on that was going to set a path, and it set that path. So, what about Palestinian nationalism? So this is what I will talk about very briefly, because I talk about sort of the decline of Arabism, because we know that set the mood not only in terms of setting back the aspirations of PanArabism, but also of reviving statism, by which I mean Egypt wanted its own territory more than it wanted anything else. Syria wanted to negotiate ultimately about the Golan Heights, that everybody was negotiating about their issues, with Palestine in a way paying a price, initially a smaller price, but ultimately a bigger price. And certainly this was accelerated by the 73 war, where the Arabs did better than before and actually restored some of the dignity that they had lost in 1967, but nonetheless were not able to regain control of either the Sinai or the Golan Heights, even separate from the West Bank and Gaza. So basically, it then set the track for Egypt to go it alone with Israel, and ultimately even Syria went into bilateral talks that failed, but nonetheless they were bilateral talks for peace. But for Palestinian nationalism, there was an immediate reality, and I think you can see it where the PLO, which had been established in '64, but really under the control of Egypt, immediately seeks independence in '68 and revises a charter that refers to Palestinian nationalism and immediately rejects 242, because 242, the resolution that was passed by the UN after '67 calling for Israeli withdrawal, also called for rights of refugees and didn't refer to Palestinian nationalism, and immediately the Palestinians wanted to make a point of it in '68. What also happened in '68, if you think about that aspiration, essentially the Palestinians saying, we've counted on pan-Arabism and here's what we got. We've got to count on ourselves. And every time, by the way, across the history, you see that Palestinians take things into their own hands when the Arab states start going back. Remember, the 1987 Intifada starts ultimately when the Arabs were preoccupied in the Iran-Iraq war for a full decade. 1993 essentially is a Palestinian initiative to make peace with the Israelis separately when the U.S. wasn't paying attention, the Arab world after the Iraq war wasn't paying attention to them. In 2000, after the collapse of the negotiations, took things into their own hands. So Palestinians have done that over the years. But in '68, it was a critical moment because this is the rise of the PLO as an independent organization, and with it, a lot of other Palestinian organizations, including the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine. And one of the things that happen, if you think about the psychology, is just as people are depressed about the prospects of Arab action, you have this a lot of stories about Palestinian guerrillas carrying out successful attacks. But one episode in particular happens almost immediately after the war in March 1968, and that is the Battle of Khurram. The Battle of Khurram, in which Israeli forces went into Jordan to round up PLO forces that were near the town of Khurram. And there's a whole dispute about the exact narrative about what exactly happened, how many Israelis were killed, how much did the Jordanian play a role, didn't play a role, who among the Palestinians played the role. And there's a dispute. We have some facts about how many Israelis were killed or equipment was destroyed, but that all doesn't matter. Why doesn't it matter? Because the narrative that emerged, the Arab narrative, was that the Israelis were soundly defeated in the Battle of Khurram, that the few PLO fighters alone did what all of the Arab armies couldn't do in 1967. And within a couple of days, there were 5,000 Palestinians going to refugee camps to sign on to join the PLO. And so if you want a kind of a galvanizing episode, as always happens in the national movement, that was a galvanizing episode. And with it, you emerge the Palestinian national movement. I want to talk about one more episode before I bring it to now and give you my reflections on where we are now. And that episode is 1974, when the PLO is recognized as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. I want to talk about that because, of course, 67 set a path, and that path included the 73 war, because 73 war became inevitable by the 67 war. And I say that for a lot of reasons, but it's not just, quote, the dignity that Arabs felt that was lost that they had to gain back, the international respect, but also the fact for Egypt itself, not just because Egypt hadn't given up on pan-Arabism, and even though, Nasser, those of you who know that history, Jamal Abdel Nasser, who was still loved even after his defeat, people may have been depressed about him, but they still saw him a source of the hope. And in 1970, the Jordanian forces go to war with Palestinian groups in Jordan, and defeats them and forces them out of Jordan, and Jamal Abdel Nasser, the hero of Palestine, didn't raise a finger other than do diplomacy. He was trying to mediate, not to intervene. The Syrians tried to send some forces, and they did send some forces, and it wasn't, they were not effective. But Nasser did not act. Nasser was mediating between King Hussein and the Palestinians, and almost metaphorically, he died the next day after he ended. He was in the middle of that mediation. Nasser was the one who started the planning for '73 war. He had this rule of thumb afterward that he announced: what is taken by force can only be returned by force. ما يؤخذ بالقوة لا يسترد بغير القوة. This was his point, and he had this plan to fight a war as soon as possible, and he wanted to restore it. One thing that people don't quite get is that for Egypt, of course, there was a dignity issue about the location of Egypt, because one of the things, the claim that they were making about Arab leadership rested on the military ability. What else? What are you going to deliver if you're not going to deliver that? And so, for sure. But there's something else that people don't really quite understand about the path for Egypt. This had been a military regime. It still is. It has never left since 1952. Yes, it was popular, but it was a military regime. The legitimacy rested with the effectiveness of its military, because that is what is the quarter, the anchor of the regime. And in '67, the military was humiliated. It wasn't just defeated; it was humiliated. And the Egyptians, a wonderful people. I love Egypt. And when you look at the Egyptian sense of humor, most of you know the Egyptian sense of humor is just infectious. I love to hear jokes about, and usually it's about self-depreciation, about the self. And they made so many jokes about the Egyptian army at that time that it was really, really tragic in a way. It was biting. And so the Egyptian military, the regime, needed to restore its dignity even for regime stability beyond its ability. So this was set in force. And in '73, Arabs did a lot better than anyone could have imagined. And in some ways, they did restore their dignity. And there was a moment, in fact, the first few days of the war, when Israel contemplated ideas that it had never thought it would come to that. And ultimately, it didn't succeed in returning all the territories, but it succeeded in restoring Arab leverage, and it succeeded in getting international intervention, Egyptian, American, and Soviet, and it succeeded in putting the Arab-Israeli conflict back on the front burner. But here's the thing: so you're in the middle of this moment where the Arabs are celebrating what was a political victory, and it was a political victory, especially under the circumstances when nobody expected it. And they were also celebrating the emergence of their economic might. Remember, there was an Arab oil embargo that was connected to that moment. And so here is the ascendant moment of Arab influence for the first time, perhaps in the 20th century. Because when you look at it, where is the other moment where you had this sense of Arab success, of Arab pride, of Arab influence, projecting itself? You could see it in the UN, you could see it in Europe, you could see it in meetings, you could see it in speeches, you could see it in how people felt across the board. Despite the limited effectiveness of the military, the fact is they were far more effective than anyone could have imagined. And so here's the moment where you would think would be a moment of Arab revival. And in fact, by the way, there has never been a more effective Arab coordination in war than in that war. Because yes, the two parties that fought it out were Syria and Egypt, and by the way, they coordinated in ways that were remarkable, particularly in secret, since it wasn't really out there. But there was a lot of coordination for countries that didn't fight directly that helped bank it. That is the Saudis, particularly Saudi Arabia with King Faisal, and Algeria with Huwari Boumediene. They were partners to that war. They funded it. They were part of the winning the victory party that was there. And so I say this, so you're looking at this, and from at some level, you would think to yourself, well, this is the moment of Arab ascendance. If Nasser had been there, this is the moment that he would have wanted to capture. But on the other side, this was exactly the opposite of that moment. Because it was the moment when the Arabs chose to say to the Palestinians, yes, we embrace you, but you're on your own. And the way I read the 1974 Rabat conference that accepted the Palestinians, the PLO, as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians, is that it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, they tell the Palestinians, we support you, and we support your nationalism, and we support your right to self-determination. And on the other hand, says, but that gives us the right to go it alone. It gave the right for Egypt to go it alone. So it became a national issue, and therefore, in some ways, it reduced by default the nature of that Palestine was still supported by Arabs, but not as a cornerstone of Arabism, but as an Arab country, one of many. And so, in that regard, I saw I wrote about this, by the way, because I did a lot of research on how this came about, because there was a debate in the Arab world and among Arab leaders about whether to embrace the PLO. Certainly, Egypt, up until then, had claimed to speak for the Palestinians. I mean, Nasser certainly did, because he speaks for Palestine. Arab nationalists didn't want to separate them from the broader cause, and it was a question of who leads the cause. Also, the Jordanians always claimed to be speaking for the Palestinians. Obviously, Jordan had annexed the West Bank in 1950. Claimed it as its own, and by the way, the Jordanians continued to pay salaries to Palestinians after the occupation all the way until 1988. King Hussein Henry Kissinger lobbied Anwar Sadat to not declare the PLO as the sole legitimate representative. He said, if you want to do that, either call them a representative, one of many, or say at least the representative of Palestinians outside of Jordan, but not in Jordan. And meaning also not of the West Bank. And ultimately, and Sadat was going back and forth, even though the foreign ministry was advising him he should recognize the PLO as the sole legitimate representative. But when they went to Rabat, it was clear that King Faisal and Houari Boumediene, the president of Algeria, who gave the first speeches, were fully on the side of the PLO, and Sadat went along with them. And that became ultimately the deal of the day, but not without the King of Jordan not fully accepting it. As I said, he never gave up connection to the West Bank until 1988, and not without the Israelis going to Henry Kissinger in the following disengagement agreements, by Kissinger making a deal with the Israelis not to recognize the PLO or deal directly with the PLO, which remained all the way until the late 1980s. So it was that's point of emergence of obviously the PLO as a sole legitimate representative that led to more focus on Palestinian self-determination, and ultimately led to the idea of the two-state solution being accepted. I just want to say that. So looking at that history, where does that leave us now? So let me give you just some thoughts that I have, more reflective thoughts on some of the issues that come up, and what I'm thinking about them. If I could find my one page here on that, but it doesn't matter. I'll do it without it. First, I think let's start again with the occupation. The term occupation, which is now again in dispute from the Israeli right, not from the Palestinians, has been a double-edged sword for the Palestinians. Why is that? Well, on the one hand, it clearly means that that the territories that are, quote, occupied are not Israeli territories. that they must be given back to their rightful owners, that what Israel can and cannot do in the occupied territories have limits under international law, because we have a body of law that governs occupied territories. And in that sense, that's good for the Palestinians. But on the other hand, it has done something different, because normally we think of occupation, or the international law certainly conceived of occupation as a temporary state of affairs, meaning one that is supposed to end quickly. And so this is, in a way, you could look at it like emergency measures, that you're accepting certain emergency measures for a brief period of time until you have a political solution. And, well, I mean, I needn't tell you, this has not been a temporary state of affairs. I needn't tell you that, because it's lasted 50 years so far. And I say it's lasted 50 years, again, thinking about it from the point of view of the humiliation, of the injustice on the ground, the daily pain that people have to go through every single day of their lives, and to think that the overwhelming majorities of Palestinians in the West Bank have known nothing but occupation. They were born under occupation. Many were born and died under occupation. So this is a lifetime for them. And then when you ask me personally as an analyst, we know we have is it one state, two states? Is there a should we support this diplomacy, that diplomacy? We all want to see diplomacy succeed at bringing about a just, equitable solution. But if you ask me as an analyst who's been at it for years, so tell me, what is your best prediction 10 years from now? You'll look ahead and say, what is your best bet 10 years from now? Well, I have to tell you, obviously none of us know what's going to happen 10 years from now, so don't get me wrong. But if I had to put my money, where would I put my money? I would say status quo, plus or minus, with many more people dead and much more suffering along the way. That is the safest analyst bet, is to say nothing much is going to change except maybe a little more suffering and more death. Maybe give or take, maybe a little here, a little there, more annexation, more this and more that. And I think to myself, we've got to deal with the human lives in these territories, not based on the prospect of peace, because that hasn't come and it doesn't look good now. And you got to look at it as if this is what you get, and fight for human rights every single day, because that's all you've got. And I think for me, it should not, any possibility of a diplomacy, which should not be opposed, should not take away from the real focus that should be our own 50 years from now, 50 years after 67, which is that there are people who don't have basic rights living in those territories. And you've got to address that regardless of, decouple diplomacy, because diplomacy, what happened is that when we have diplomacy, people are saying, well, this is temporary, be patient, we're working on it. We're working on it. We're working on it. And there's some truth to it sometimes, but most of the time it hasn't worked out that way. And we can't use diplomacy as a way to divert our attention from the human reality on the ground that is totally unacceptable. So that's number one. Number two, I say, I already talked about how the Arabs are more divided than ever. Their leverage has been diminished remarkably, given a whole set of issues that have taken place over the past several years. And we see that they're more divided than they're united, not only on Palestine, but even on issues that have to do with them. And look at this war in the Gulf between members of the Gulf Cooperation Council, wealthy Arab states, that has taken place right now, just as an example of that. Look at the leverage. So among Arab governments right now, there's certainly no unanimity on what to do on Palestine. And more depressingly, Arab publics are distracted. In the old days, it used to be true that the Arabs, as a people, focused on Palestine, even as the governments did not. And I've done many public opinion polls over the years to show that that issue remains important among Arab people as a symbol of their collective identity. Even an Egyptian sees Palestine as part of his identity. Certainly Arabs see Palestine as part of their identity. And that used to be more the case. But now, as you know, Arabs are preoccupied, and legitimately so. If you're living in Syria, the hell that you're experiencing, obviously you are focused on your tragedy. If you're living in Yemen, if you're living in Libya, if you're living in Iraq, and all the challenges of the struggles internally that we're facing in much of the Arab world, it certainly distracts even the people from that issue. But one thing that is clear to me, that issue has not gone away from Arab minds, even in this arena. How do I know that? And let me give you just 3 examples. One is, look at the 2 countries that have made peace with Israel. There are only 2 states that have signed peace treaties, that is Jordan and Egypt. And you look at their public opinion, and the public opinion is the most opposed to relations with Israel. And in the public opinion polls, that was the most pro-Palestinian of the countries. And people are talking about cold peace between Egypt and Israel. Well, there is cold peace because the public is not there. And the public is focused on something else. It hasn't gone away. Even in this environment, it hasn't gone away. Second, when you subconsciously, even as are preoccupied with something else, when you ask people, do you like Trump or don't you like Trump? Do you like Merkel or you don't like Merkel? There are many reasons why people like it or dislike it, but still the shortest cut is to ask the question, what's their position on Israel-Palestine? It's still a subconscious test that people do behind their mind. And you can see it in the discourse, even the government-sponsored discourse, where they go through that to say, here's the example of is not good for us because that's, so subconsciously it's still there. And third is that when you are looking at Arab rulers who obviously are not focused on Palestine, I mean, let's not kid ourselves. None of them are focused on Palestine. Everyone has their own struggle, in some cases survival struggle, that they're focused on. Not that they don't care about Palestine, I don't want to go that far, because the publics will make sure that they do up to a point. But that's not a central issue for them, obviously not a central issue for them. And yet look at this war that we're now seeing between, whether it's between the Islamists or the secularists, between the different states, coalitions in the Gulf, and look at how one ruler tries to delegitimize another ruler. What do they do to delegitimize the other ruler? The first thing to do is to claim they're working for Israel, or that there's some Israeli connection that delegitimizes them, as is the case now. Stories about Qatar, or stories about the ambassador of the UAE in the US. All these stories in different presses tells you the fact that they're using it even as they're doing business with Israel, that they think the public is still focused on this issue. It's not going away. And this is a difficult time, it's a painful time, not just for the Palestinians. It is particularly difficult for the Palestinians to remember the 50th occasion, not to remember and not to forget the refugees, by the way, outside, and particularly the ones in places like Lebanese camps who are in a horrific, under horrific conditions. But now we've had millions of refugees come out of Syria and Iraq. And so the tragedy is pervasive. And Palestinians have to also think about the rest of the Arab world, have empathy with others as they want empathy with themselves. This is a painful period for the Arab world all the way around. This is not just for the Palestinians. And the Palestinians obviously pay more of a price because they're inevitably linked to other Arabs, and their prospects are inevitably linked by the leverage that Arabs bring to bear. But this, of course, as we have seen in the history of the past century, is not going to last. And Palestinians are not going away. Palestinian nationalism is reality and a fact. I don't think anything can change that fact. And what is going on for the Palestinians, beside this political consciousness and the fact that they have they have broader sympathy beyond the Arab world on the human rights and international law dimension, is that Israel, frankly, does not have a unilateral ability to impose a lasting solution without them. And ultimately, clearly, there will be a day when Palestinians will find certainly more dignity than they are finding today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Could you just elaborate a little bit on Qatar? What is that all about? How does it,
on what?
on Qatar?
Yeah.
How does that fit into the Arab dynamic?
That's a really long story, but I'm just going to give you sort of the short end of it, because Qatar has had a contentious relationship with Saudi Arabia for a long time, and certainly back in the 1990s. And I think one reason why the Qataris started Al Jazeera was in a way to fight off some of the attacks they were getting from Saudi and Egyptian media. But more recently, it's really my own opinion. It's principally a function of their sympathy with the Muslim Brotherhood and Al Jazeera's independence from the narrative that is around them. That those two are big. They're all trying to. They've declared that the Muslim Brotherhood is a terrorist organization. They've gone to war with, and all particularly Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, and certainly the Saudis came on board of that. And the Qataris still are seen to be empowering them, even as they've been declared as a central enemy. So, with Trump coming on board and making a deal, particularly the Saudi Trump deal, it's obvious that they felt that they had a green light to exercise power. They've been trying to persuade Qatar to expel leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood or speakers like Yusuf al-Qaradawi from there, or to clamp down Al Jazeera, meaning to either close it or to stop putting out stories that are critical of Arab governments. And they've modified their style a little bit. They've responded up to a point, but not enough, obviously. And I think they've seen this. Now, Iran obviously is part of the story, although I personally don't think the Iran story is the big piece of this, even though it's being portrayed that way. I think it's more about the Muslim Brotherhood and Al Jazeera. Sure. Yeah, George.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely presentation. I want you to change your focus a little bit on America and the 50th anniversary.
And what?
And this 50th anniversary.
Okay.
Were you surprised how the New York Times and the Washington Post ran lengthy pieces and analysis on the issue, and while on the other side, the Arab diplomats, we've got over 50 Arab diplomats in Washington and New York, and a new active Palestinian ambassador here, have not done anything to tell our side of the story.
Yeah,
I could go into
questions. I know that's a commentary more than a question, George. So it is indeed puzzling, but that goes to the point. Yes, absolutely. I mean, it goes to the point that I was making, which is, Arabs don't want to focus on this issue. They don't want something to remind the publics of this. And here in the U.S., obviously, it's remembered in different ways, including many celebrate it as the greatest Israeli victory. Particularly, you have a lot of support for Israel, so you can understand why they're happier about telling the story, because it's not one of humiliation from the point of view of Israelis. But frankly, it was an occasion to tell the story about the occupation, and you find a lot of groups in America that have focused on the humiliation and the seemingly unending occupation, including, to their credit, Jewish newspapers like Forward, where they put out voices, that highlighted that. And we don't see the same thing in the Arab world. And this is part of the tragedy that we're witnessing today. Well, as I said, I think the way I explain it is that they're waging wars that had nothing to do with Palestine right now. Some of them see it as wars of survival, the wars of narrative. They don't want their opponents to gain an upper hand in that. Palestine plays into their opponents' hands, and they don't want that. And so they keep it out as much as possible. And I think that's the real story. Any other questions? Thank you very much.